Module 10, the endocrine system. Hormone receptors in the body. You are very familiar now with how and where hormones in the body are synthesized and their method of release. But they cannot do their job unless there's a way for cells to receive their, quote, message. Kind of like the old-fashioned telegraph system where a sender would send a message in Morse code along a pathway of wires. That message cannot be delivered unless there's a device on the other end that can receive it. Well, with hormones, target cells are the message receivers. They have hormone receptors, which are special proteins on or inside target cells to receive their specific hormone signals. Remember when I talked about type 2 diabetes mellitus? It is a result of a lack of receptors for insulin. So not only do you need hormones for endocrine control, you need receptors for those hormones. Cells can have one of two types of hormone receptors. Membrane-bound receptors are exactly what the name suggests. They are receptors that are located on the plasma membrane of target cells. When the hormone comes to the cell, it binds to the receptor because they perfectly fit together, like a lock and key. The only way any chemical can bind to this receptor is if it has a shape that fits it. What kinds of hormones stimulate membrane-bound receptors? Well, protein and peptide hormones, and all the amine hormones, with the exception of thyroxine. This is because protein and peptides are large water-soluble molecules. That means they cannot easily dissolve through the lipid layer of the cell membrane. Additionally, they are large molecules that are too big to enter the cell anyway. Thus, they can best stimulate the cell from the outside. And most amine hormones are kind of big as well, and they're also polar. Therefore, they too cannot easily enter the cell. The exception to amine hormones here is thyroxine, because chemically it is able to enter the cell.
Membrane-bound receptors are kind of like the ignition in a car. It's not going to start the car until you have a key that's perfectly shaped to fit that ignition to get it to go. In the same way with the cell, the membrane-bound receptors won't get the cell machinery to start until you have a perfectly fit hormone key that fits into that perfectly designed receptor to start the cell machinery. Now, all the machinery is there. Just like the car, I've got my engine and my oil and my gas and my belts and everything ready to go. But this car isn't going to start until the key fits into the ignition. In the same way with your cell, when the hormone key fits into that membrane-bound receptor, it turns on the cell machinery in a matter of moments to get that cell to do what it's designed to do. In the same way that this car starts right away.
Nuclear receptors are the second receptor type. They are located at the nucleus, and they behave a bit differently. The hormone has to diffuse into the cell, making its way through the cytoplasm until it reaches the nucleus. That is where it will bind to a receptor protein. When it does this, it activates a specific gene in the cell's DNA, which then becomes transcribed to messenger RNA that takes the information outside the nucleus in order to make a protein or enzyme at the site of a protein synthesizer cell machine. That protein or enzyme will produce the response that the hormone was signaling for. Thus, with nuclear receptors, the cell actually will create those specific proteins or enzymes only when they receive that hormone signal. You can imagine then that this response is slower than the membrane-bound receptor and hormone interaction because the cells have to first make the chemicals for the reaction to occur. Steroid hormones are hormones that utilize nuclear receptors because they are lipid-soluble and can diffuse through the plasma membrane of the cell. And thyroxine is also a hormone that utilizes nuclear receptors too. Now there's a bit more to this receptor story. Not only is the presence of receptors necessary for hormone communication in the body, but receptors can increase or decrease in number, and that will affect endocrine function. You see, target cells can make more of a receptor. That is called upregulation. If there are more receptors, then the cells are much more able to bind with their key hormones, which makes those cells more responsive. There are even hormones that influence target cells to do just this for other hormones. That way, those cells will be more sensitive to that second hormone. A good example of upregulation has to do with two types of drugs that women can receive during childbirth. The first is Pitocin. It has a medication that strengthens uterine contractions to help labor move more rapidly. Pitocin is a similar chemical to oxytocin, which is a natural hormone that causes the uterus to contract, so it behaves in the body similarly. Now compare it to a drug called Cytotec. It is also used to help labor move more rapidly, but it works by stimulating the cells in the uterus to increase how many receptors they have for oxytocin. Thus, those cells are more sensitive to oxytocin and more likely to bind with it, causing an increased response. Now, when a target cell loses receptors, that is called downregulation. When cells have fewer receptors for a specific hormone, they are less responsive to it. Receptors don't have to be removed, remember, they're proteins, so they will naturally break down over time. It's just that the target cell doesn't replace as many of them.